Likutei Torah, Parsha Tzav, page Yud Gimel, second column, Eis Beis. Okay, last thing that Rebbe is explaining is, bottom line is that there's two matzahs. There's a matzah before Chatzos, which was before the revelation of Elokus, that they were commanded to do. Then there was a matzah after Chatzos that the dough didn't have time to rise. And the matzah that we eat today, before Chatzos, is like the level of the matzah they ate after Chatzos. So we just learned a few lines over here. So he says, well, because the Torah says in the pasuk, a person does not live on bread alone. So he said, this answers the question. How is it possible food? Bread comes to the level of plant life. And Adam is medaber, and human, so the question is, how can something lower than us sustain something higher? But the answer is, person doesn't live from the essence of the bread, but the Matzah Pi Hashem. That's in the lechem, which is the Maimed Tachi Odes Desha. Okay, that's what we're up to. So he says, because the word of Hashem that keeps vegetation alive, that comes into the food, and that's what's mechayed the person. But we need to understand why does a person need the Dvar Hashem that's in the food if we have our own Dvar Hashem that Hashem said Nasa Adam? Why do we need to receive l'chayis in the bread? We have our own Dvar Hashem within us. Right? This is the famous question. Okay, so he says, based on what's explained in many, many different places, the Bechin is Daimim Tzemei Chai, that the source of inanimate plant and animal comes from the world of Tehu, that Kodam Lebechinus Elamatikun. That's before, doesn't mean before in time. It means it's higher than the world of Tikkun. Ella, it came down through many, many different levels. By day, Shvirasa came through the, literally means the broken vessels. They came down all the way down. And they created gashmistic things. So in other words, as the world is, the higher the thing, the lower it falls. So, Daimim Semech and Chai come from the world of Tehu, which is higher than Tikkun, and therefore the sparks fell down very low. For Adam Shoshem Elam Tikkun, but a person comes from the world of Tikkun, and Ikar of Elam Tikkun is Chochma Vatzilus, and it's called Amshach Smechem, bringing down Seichel. Ki b'Chochma is Beriru. With Chochma you can select. For Adam Yesh Nefesh HaSichlis, and therefore a person who has intellect, okay? So therefore it says like this. Tikkun is the level of Chochma Vatzilus. The Shver Sekelim HaYibayel Matehu is in the Zayim Midas. The Zayim Midas of Tehu, but the 7 Midas of Tehu are higher than the Chochma Vatzilus, because Atzilus is Tikkun, this is even higher. Amno mein Bechin is some Midas. And it's called Behema Rabba. Behema Rabba is a level of Behema Nefesh Habamis, which comes in the world of Tehu. So therefore it's called Behema Rabba because it's Behemoth is Midas, person is Seichel. So Tikkun is primarily the level of Adam, which is the level of Seichel. Behema is a level of Tehu, which comes from a higher level. But that's why it says in the pasuk, Adam be'behema teshi Hashem. Adam is 45, Behem is 52. These are the two names, Ma and Ban. Ma equals 45, Ban equals 52. And that's the level of Tehu and Tikkun. Okay, skip the brackets. Top of the page of 26. So why did with the Shviras HaKelim and the Midas of Tehu? He says, because there is no unity. Tehu is straight chesed, straight gvura, straight teferes, but you didn't have the unity between the different midas. So therefore, they fell down lower than a person, but in the source they originate in a higher place. Therefore, they need to become refined. Dafka through Adam, okay? So therefore, he says like this: they need to birur, like he said before. Chachma is biriru. Chachma refines, refining, selecting all these different things. Tikkun has to refine tehu. The chachma is biriru. Tehu is primarily midas. That's what the Shviras HaKelim was. Tikkun is primarily Chachma Vatzilus. So Chachma Vatzilus has to refine the level of Tehu. So how does that happen? The sparks of Tehu fell down here, because otherwise how can Tikkun elevate Tehu if it's up there in Tehu? So it has to fall down into this world. The person is the one that refines the midas of Tehu. But after you refine them, they give life to the person. Why? Because it's higher even than the person. It's a higher level than Adam, because it comes from Tehu. So before they're refined, down here they're lower than Tikkun. After they're refined, they're higher than Tikkun. And therefore, it's not something lower sustaining something higher, it's something higher sustaining something lower. What does it mean, Matzah pi Hashem? It doesn't say the word of Hashem. Matzah is the source of pi Hashem. That's the source of the Dvar Hashem, the Asar of Maimonides. So the bread comes from even a higher level. That's why, that's the reason Shamayim and Nasa Adam who Achar my Asar of Maimonides. Why Adam is higher than everything else? Why is Adam, the last Maimon of all 10 Maimonim, is Nasa Adam? Because Tachios is really higher than Nasa Adam, because it comes from Teil. Why is it Mitama now? Because those things come from the world of Teil, which is the source of Adam. Okay? So bottom line is, now the Rebbe is explaining that Tehu elevates Tikkun. You need Tikkun to refine Tehu, but after Tikkun refines Tehu, Tehu is higher than Tikkun. Therefore the Gemara brings down a story. They asked Rav Nachman a shayla and he didn't know. And the next day he told the guy the answer. He says, the reason I didn't answer you at night, because I didn't eat the beef, I didn't eat dinner basically. Which means, what that answer is, I didn't answer because he didn't eat. Because by eating, it gives him more chayas, and he's able to understand things much better. Like everybody knows, on the fasting, most people are dysfunctional. When it comes out, not only does food give koyach to the physical person, but even more than that, it adds even to the seichel of the person. Like you see from Rav Nachman. The same thing the Gemara says. A child doesn't know how to say the word Abba until he eats grain, meaning food. Now, come from the world of Tehu, which is higher than the Chochmah of Tikkun. Therefore, it has the strength and ability, even the chokhmah of the person. And he says, what?
When we discuss halacha, this phenomenon happens, bringing down from gold to tikkun.
Yeah, anything. Teo adds seichel chokhmah to seichel to chokhmah. The food gives you strength not only physically, but it gives you strength mentally too, even to the level of chokhmah. Because midas of teo are higher than the seichel of tikkun. Ukemeikin in yuvam ba'avedus Hashem shazeu inyan b'rapach nitzusim. Of teo, this is the refinement of the 288 parts of teo. Shamalubish b'dvarim gashmi. That came into gashmistic things. Shem is buried in the elam l'mayla b'chinas hatikun, which is sherish nefesh olikis. Okay, it's even higher than the source of the nefesh olikis. Now it says in Kabbalah that there's rapach nitzutzim. Okay, by shviras hakelim, it says 288 sparks of Kedusha fell down. The Alter Rebbe says in Torah, I'm sure it's many other places, that where do you get this cheshbon rapach from? So it says, V'roch ha'lekim merachefes al pnei hamoyim. Merachefes means the Spirit of Hashem hovered over the water. At the beginning of creation. Merachefes, the first and last letter is mes, and then the middle is rapach. So it says, Rapach, Mes, that means they died, they came down, the Shviras HaKelim, they died from Teo, and they came down into V'roch ha'lekim merachefes al pnei hamoyim, that the sparks, the Rapach sparks of Teo that died came down into this world. So how do we elevate it? By davening and doing krishma and davening. Shebechin is koyav v'chayish in the teisebei. Ayidei achila l'shem shemayim, through eating, and therefore you have koyach to daven better. So it happens in nichul be'echad v'yohavta. It becomes part of echad and v'yohavta, u'meisev koyach is beininus, and causes a person to understand things better. V'yispainis ava Hashem, and to have more ava Hashem. Lias is beininus v'adas v'ava v'yidah b'teikev. V'yiskashrus, to have it stronger in a greater bond, more than nefesh olikis atzma. Because now you get the koyach from Teo. So in other words, how do we elevate Teo? When you eat food from Teo, and then you learn to daven with that koyach, so you're elevating the sparks of Teo. Then, because you're elevated, it reaches a higher level than Tikkun, and therefore it gives strength to Tikkun. V'hainu mitama now. Sheyesh shemelubish b'rapach nitzutz the Teo shelamayim b'chinas haTikkun. Because you have the 288 sparks of Teo, which is higher than Tikkun, al kain b'yichol tamleis and gilui. Gam leb'chinas chochma u'midah shebenefesh olikis, how b'krishma tefillah v'etzek ha'Torah mitzvahs. Okay, the bottom line is, now the Rebbe is explaining over here, now he's going to go into Matzah, back into Matzah. He's explaining that there's a level of Teo, there's a level of Tikkun. Teo supports Tikkun, but Teo can only give strength to Tikkun. After Tikkun, we find Teo. And there's Teo coming down itself is just evil. It comes into Klippa. If it's Klippa Sneiga, then a Jew can elevate it by utilizing for Torah mitzvahs, if it's permissible stuff. Okay, so now he says, Vapi Agdom in Gimel. Vapi Agdoma now, through this introduction, Yuven binyan achilus matzah b'chag Pesach. Now we can understand the concept of eating matzah and Pesach. The mevor b'zayir v'yetze, k'mei shebas kolos gashmis, just like in physical seichel, ein atinigidei amasku klum, achetayim lechem k'mevor atam l'mayla. Just like the Gemara says, that a baby doesn't know how to call even father. In other words, he doesn't even have that maturity of seichel until he eats grain, and like he explained the reason before, because it comes from Tehu. So the same thing by the Yidden. When the Yidden left Mitzrayim, La yodu lahaskil b'dreilis Hashem. They didn't have the ability to understand the greatness of Hashem, ad she'achlu matzah, which is the lechem hayetim in Eretz Yoina. There's spiritual matzah. Just like the man came from heaven, it was Eretz Yoina. The same thing, matzah, in the spirituality of matzah, it comes, the source of matzah comes from Eretz Yoina. And that's why it's round, because it's Seviv Kolam and it's Makif. It comes from a very lofty level. That's why it's so expensive. Shalmei Tzapi Hashem. Later, there's another Maimon, the Alter Rebbe, later on, in called Mizmor Shir Chanukos Abayis, the Alter Rebbe asks, L'chaira, food is more important than clothing, which is more important than housing. So he says, L'chaira, then housing should be cheaper than clothing, which is cheaper, should be cheaper than food. Because food is more important. So he explains, simply the reason is because houses last longer, and clothing lasts longer, and food lasts the least. So but he says, why is it like that? So he explains, Mozain is Mamala Kolam, and Lavush is Sevim Kolam, and Bayis is the lesser, V'kula Kamei Koloi Choshev. Then, food is internalized. It's Mamala. Garments surround you, but they have to fit you. House is one size fits all, because house comes from the level of Kula Kamei Koloi Choshev. So therefore, it comes from a higher source. It comes from a higher source, it's more expensive. Especially matzah, it's very expensive because it comes from a higher source. And he says, it seems that every year, the matzah gets more expensive every year. It keeps coming from a higher level. So he says, why
don't we eat it over here?
Huh? Because it has that level when it's a mitzvah. If it's not a mitzvah, it doesn't have that level. We don't eat chametz on Pesach because chametz represents evil, yeah? So we shouldn't eat chametz a whole year. Yet chametz a whole year is not forbidden. And on Pesach it's forbidden. Because in that time of the year, that's that inyan of matzah, bittul, all these great revelations he's talking about. The rest of the year, that's not that avodah. He says, so therefore they didn't have this ability. And therefore, just like physical seichel comes from physical bread, kach nimshach me'achiyas matzah b'Pesach. So that's why matzah is michla da'imnusa and michla da'asvasa. Michla matzah, the first night is the level of amunah, and the second night is healing, not only physical healing, spiritual healing, right? That's the level of chayla. If you're missing, like the Rabbi writes in Tzav, that chayla equals 49. That means you're 49 levels of kedusha, you're missing the 50th, you're called chayla. So matzah heals even that level. So matzah is these lofty levels. So he says like this: Kachnim shech me'achidus matzah b'Pesach chayis lo das nefesh shulikis. It adds das to the nefesh shulikis. So he says, what is the inyan in this? Ki chametz. What is chametz? Yagbov is nasus. Is haughtiness and elevating oneself. He blows himself up. Matzah doesn't rise. It's bittul. Chametz is bechinas is nasus v'gasas aklipa. What's ruchni is the chametz? Klipa. And even afsiyot and the things like that. Mashenkin matzah is the level of shiftless v'achno, the level of bebato tzeincha. And like it says, v'zel ki is chametz levavi. The David Melch says, ki is chametz levavi, my heart becomes chametz. Meaning, him shul alev and neitel arshia. It gives a marshal of a heart that's about to become evil in the level of chametz. Or like the Gemara says about certain people, Kan Kedem Shehichmit, Kan Lacha Shehichmit. The Gemara speaks about certain people. First they were good, and then they became bad. So the Gemara says this is when they were good, it was before they became chametz, and when they were bad, it was after they became chametz. The same thing the Gemara likens the Yitzhar to Sa'ar, to yeast, which by the way is what makes it rise. But the Gemara says, "Mi ma'akav Sa'ar shebeisa, shebeisa mak hainu mineshu bechinas gas sumarko kolon afilas." But Taivas, what is the source of all downfalls? It's a level of gases. Okay? So therefore he says, what's the level of matzah? Just like physical food gives seichel to the person, matzah gives ruchniistic kedusha to the seichel of the nefesh ulakis. V'nei yedua, it's known, the begolus Mitzrayim or Yisrael mekusharim ma'id lamata. They're very, very low. They're memta shari tumah. Vayasichom umidaisam. Both the seichel and the midas were meitzarim and gvulim in the level of limitation of Mitzrayim. The garment, ve'ika Yitzias Mitzrayim. So therefore, what's primarily the inya of Yitzias Mitzrayim? Shenigla alehem melech malchi amlochim, which is Odin to Baruch Shalamayim, we say that is Talshus, which is Alokus higher than world, Sha'idei Zem, Nim Shalbam Bechinas HaBittel, that causes the level of Bittel. In other words, what happened like this? The Eden went a very low level. Okay? They were worshipping idols, the worst things possible, which all came from Gassus Morinus, ego. Then what happened? That level of Gilim Milmaila came from above, Ugolam, that we deemed them from that level of mentality, of Meitzarim and Gvulim. Kamayim made a Gadol Zu Gil Shchina. By day bit of the Yeri Law Zu Yotzuka Meitzarim and Gvulim. That's how they were able to go out of Mitzrayim. They couldn't go out of Mitzrayim when they were in Imkei HaKlipa. When they were in the depth of Klipa, there's no way they could go out of Mitzrayim. So what happened? They had to come Umayla. And therefore, there was no, if you weren't a Keli for it, you didn't go out. Because it was before Matan Torah. Therefore, those Jews that didn't want to go out, didn't go out. Now, by Mashiach and Sevatum Tuluk, every single Jew is going to go out of Golus. Why? Because now we made the Keli for it in the duration of Golus. But then they had no Keli. It was a Gilim Mamayla. So if you're a Keli for it, you got it. So if you didn't get it. The same thing, Yitzias Mitzrayim Gashmis, Zoyoach and Chatzais Line. Yitzias Mitzrayim physically, when did the Yid go out of Meitzarim and Gvulim? After Chatzais, after Nigla Le'em Melech Malchei Amloch. Because otherwise they couldn't have gone out. There's an expression, Ein Chovesh Mater Esatzmi. A prisoner cannot free himself. If a guy's stuck in the pit, he needs somebody else to help him out. A prisoner can't free himself. So the same thing, the Jews were in this level of jail, so to speak, Meitzarim and Gvulim, and they needed the Nigla Le'em to take him out. But they still had to make a Keli for that Gilui, so they had to eat Matzah before Chatzes. Like it says, Ba'erev Teichlu Matzahs. They have to eat Matzah, but it was without a Vav. It was before the Gilui of Elokus, which is a level of Bittul Ratzvach Nove Shiflas. From the level of Yeretato, that they had to do. They had to eat matzah. It wasn't a Gilim Mamayla Yira Ilah, Hashem Murder Gadol, the great level of Yira. They had to create within themselves a level of lower Yira that made this happen. Make a Keli for the Murder Gadol.
Which one is the mitzvah? Before Chatzon or after?
Before. That's what made it a Keli.
The Gilui was after Chatzon.
Correct. But in order to get the Gilui after Chatzes, they needed to make a Keli before Chatzos. That's why he gave a mitzvah of Teichel Matzahs.
But it didn't rise before Chatzot.
There wasn't allowed to shmartem some matzahs. Before Chatzos, the Torah says you have to watch, to guard the matzahs, they shouldn't become chametz. Ushmartem some matzahs. They shouldn't become chametz. That was all before Chatzos. After Chatzos, ki lo yuchelis mameh. It couldn't become chametz. Ki lo chametz, I mean. It couldn't become chametz. Because when there's that gilu of murder gadol, you get in shock, like in awe. So he says that's the yira ilah, and that's the keli, the b'chinas gilu v'yira ilah that came after Chatzos. Okay, so he says like this. That's why the Zohar calls michla dam nusa. The matzah the first night, Zohar calls michla dam nusa, the food of emunah. Meaning, what is emunah? Emunah is bittul. Emunah is I don't know, I don't understand. I'm just believe. That means there's no me, I just believe. There's no me understanding anything. It is also the level of bittul. Shemavatli sichla is mavatim the seichel. Veina mavakish tam, he says I don't even have to understand it. Rak maimen o emes b'munah tehino. V'nim shebachina zu b'neshama. Ay mitzvah achilas matzah. That's the mitzvah of eating matzah. When Hashem gave the Yid the mitzvah of achilas matzah, that level of mitzvah that they did, that caused this level of amunah within them, the level of bittul, yira tata, that now became a keli for the gilu of yira ilah. But they needed a keli. And he said, that's like he explained before, Lachem b'chayis adam. Like my brother Zayin and Tidik Yedeh Likreis Abba Achiyitain, right? And he says, this that the food makes him call Abba is also not that he understands, oh, now I understand how it's my father. He doesn't know why it's his father. That's different than any other guy in the street. But that instills, so to speak, the amunah, and not seichel, the amunah that this is my father.
Not because his father pays for the food.
That he thinks when he's a teenager. I close with this.